You sit in silence and look at yourself, but something feels slightly off, like your reflection is not fully keeping up with you, and even though nothing has changed in the room, your attention keeps splitting between who you are and how you appear, and in this moment your mind begins doing something subtle but powerful. It starts observing instead of experiencing, and you don't notice when it begins, but suddenly being yourself feels like watching yourself, and this quiet shift becomes the beginning of a pattern where presence slowly turns into self-analysis without permission or awareness at all. As you move through your daily life, another part of your mind begins to rise above you, silently watching everything you do, how you walk, how you react, how you speak, and slowly you stop feeling like a single unified self and instead begin feeling like two versions of yourself existing at the same time, one living and one analyzing, and the strange thing is that nothing outside has changed, but inside your attention has split, and now every action carries a silent question behind it, as if something inside you is constantly asking whether you are doing life correctly or not. Inside your mind, awareness is no longer just awareness, it becomes a system that constantly labels everything you do, sorting your actions into categories like good or bad, normal or strange, acceptable or embarrassing, and without realizing it, you begin living inside a mental control room where every thought and behavior is being evaluated in real time, not by others, but by your own mind, and this constant internal scoring system slowly changes how you behave, because instead of simply acting naturally, you begin adjusting yourself based on imagined outcomes that exist only inside your prediction of how you might be perceived. You are not just experiencing moments anymore, you are evaluating them as they happen, and even in simple situations your mind produces small silent comments about yourself, questioning your tone, your posture, your reactions, and these thoughts feel like they are helping you improve, but in reality they are pulling you out of the moment itself, and instead of being present, you are constantly reviewing yourself from a distance, and this creates a subtle tension where nothing feels fully natural anymore, because a part of your attention is always busy checking whether you are behaving correctly or not in every situation. Your mind begins to act like it is always being observed, even when no one is watching, and this imagined observation creates a kind of invisible pressure around your behavior, as if you are living inside a transparent structure made of silent expectations, and inside this space you start filtering everything you do, not because someone is judging you directly, but because your brain is simulating judgment all the time. And slowly this imagined audience becomes more influential than real people, shaping how you act, how you speak, and even how you think about yourself in moments that should feel completely free. Over time, this constant self-monitoring changes the way your personality grows, because instead of expressing yourself freely, you start adapting your behavior to avoid discomfort, and it feels like you are making small improvements, but what is actually happening is that your natural expression is being shaped by invisible restrictions inside your mind, and like a plant growing inside a glass box, your behavior begins bending in ways that avoid internal pressure, even though no real danger exists, and this creates a quiet disconnect between who you are and who you think you need to be in order to feel acceptable. There comes a point where you are no longer just living your actions, but also documenting them internally in real time, as if a silent observer inside you is taking notes on everything you do, and this observer is not cruel, it simply believes it is helping you improve, but its constant recording turns ordinary moments into evaluated performances, and slowly you begin to feel like your life is something you are both participating in and reviewing at the same time, which makes even simple interactions feel heavier than they should, because nothing is allowed to simply pass without internal analysis. At some point, your attention begins standing at a silent crossroads. One direction pulls you inward toward constant self-observation, where every thought leads back to how you appear and how you are performing, and the other direction pulls you outward toward experience itself, where attention can rest on life without constantly turning back on itself, and the strange thing is that both paths feel equally real, but only one of them allows you to feel fully present, while the other keeps you slightly detached, always aware, always evaluating, never fully inside the moment you are actually living. When your attention finally shifts outward, something subtle begins to change inside your experience of life, because instead of constantly monitoring how you appear, you start noticing what is actually happening around you, the details of sound, movement, and presence begin to return, and in that shift the intensity of self-observation weakens slightly, not because it disappears completely, but because it is no longer the center of your awareness, and in that space you begin to feel a small, but important sense of relief, as if your mind is remembering how to exist without constantly watching itself from a distance. Inside your mind, attention behaves like a dial that can shift direction without you realizing it, and when it is turned inward you become highly aware of yourself, your actions, your thoughts, your image, but when it turns outward, your awareness begins to merge with experience instead of observation, and the difference between these two states is not about thinking more or thinking less, but about where your attention chooses to stay. Because peace is not the absence of awareness, it is the absence of constant self-surveillance, and this shift is what slowly begins to bring you back into natural presence again. In moments where you once felt watched, something begins to shift quietly inside your response system, because the same situations that used to trigger overthinking no longer create the same internal reaction, and instead of scanning yourself for mistakes, you start noticing that the feeling of being judged was never fully external, it was something your mind was generating automatically, and as this realization settles deeper, you begin to experience a small gap between stimulus and reaction, where external presence no longer immediately turns into internal evaluation, and that gap slowly becomes the beginning of emotional freedom from constant self-observation. Your brain is not trying to make you uncomfortable on purpose, it is simply running an old survival program that was designed to detect social danger before it happens, and this system constantly scans your environment and your own behavior for anything that might lead to rejection or disapproval, even when no real threat exists, and the problem is not the system itself, but the fact that it has become too sensitive in modern life, turning harmless interactions into potential risks, and this creates a constant background noise of evaluation that follows you even in safe and ordinary situations. Inside your mind, two systems constantly compete for control over your attention. One system is designed to let you experience life directly without interference, while the other is designed to evaluate everything you do in real time, and when both systems operate at equal strength, your experience becomes fragmented, because part of you is living the moment while another part is analyzing it simultaneously, and this creates a subtle internal conflict that prevents full immersion in any situation, not because something is wrong with you, but because your cognitive architecture is trying to balance awareness and self-monitoring at the same time. There are moments when the internal pressure slightly weakens, and in those moments you may notice that your thoughts feel lighter and your behavior feels more natural without conscious effort, and this happens not because you are trying to fix yourself, but because attention temporarily stops feeding the evaluation loop, and when that loop loses energy, your mind naturally returns to a more stable and effortless state of being, where actions do not need to be constantly corrected or analyzed, and instead they unfold without interruption, showing you what presence feels like when self-monitoring is no longer dominating your awareness system. When self-awareness becomes less dominant, something very noticeable begins to return in your communication, because instead of interrupting your speech with constant self-evaluation, your thoughts begin flowing more directly into expression, and you stop mentally editing every sentence before it is spoken, and this creates a smoother experience of interaction where you are not constantly monitoring how you sound, and instead you are focused on what you are actually saying, and this shift does not make you more perfect, but it makes you more natural, because your attention is no longer split between living the moment and correcting it at the same time. As the internal monitoring system weakens, your behavior begins to return to a more natural form, not because you are forcing it, but because the restrictions that were shaping your expression are no longer active at the same intensity, and this allows your thoughts and actions to grow in a more organic direction, similar to a plant that was previously bending inside a confined space now beginning to expand freely again. And this does not mean you become careless, it simply means your behavior is no longer filtered through constant self-correction before it has a chance to exist. Over time, you begin to notice that many of the internal judgments you once carried were not actual truths, but temporary evaluations created by your mind in response to uncertainty, and as this becomes clearer, the need to constantly check and correct yourself starts to lose its emotional importance, because you realize that most of these internal rules were never permanent laws about who you are, but shifting interpretations generated by a mind trying to stay safe, and when this understanding settles, you naturally begin to loosen your attachment to self-evaluation as a constant requirement for functioning in daily life. The mind does not suddenly become silent, instead it begins to reorganize its focus, and what used to feel like constant internal noise slowly shifts into a more balanced state where awareness is still present but no longer interfering with every action, and this creates a new internal experience where you are able to think without becoming trapped in your thoughts, and observe yourself without turning every moment into analysis. And this balance is not about removing self-awareness completely, but about restoring its natural position in your mental system so it supports experience instead of interrupting it. As attention moves away from constant self-observation, something interesting begins to happen in your perception of the world, because external details that were previously ignored due to internal focus start becoming more noticeable again, and this shift creates a richer and more grounded experience of reality where your mind is no longer trapped inside self-referencing loops, and instead begins processing the environment more directly, which makes everyday experiences feel more present and real, not because the world has changed, but because your attention is no longer constantly turned inward toward evaluating yourself in relation to everything around you. When the internal focus stabilizes in an outward direction, the experience of life becomes less fragmented and more continuous, because attention is no longer repeatedly collapsing back into self-evaluation, and instead it remains anchored in experience long enough for natural flow to emerge, and in this state you do not lose awareness of yourself, but you stop treating yourself as something that must be constantly monitored, and this creates a quiet form of mental stability where thinking, acting, and being no longer feel like separate processes competing for control, but different parts of one continuous experience. There is a stage where the constant internal commentary that once followed every action begins to lose its intensity, and instead of immediately analyzing everything you do, your mind starts allowing moments to simply exist without interference, and this creates a noticeable shift in how you experience daily life, because silence inside your thoughts no longer feels uncomfortable or empty, but instead begins to feel stable and neutral, and in that neutrality, you realize that not every moment requires interpretation or correction, and sometimes experience is complete even without internal explanation or evaluation happening alongside it. Your mind does not become simpler, but it becomes less entangled in itself, because the patterns that once created constant internal friction begin to loosen, and thoughts that used to interrupt each other start flowing with more space between them, and this creates a sense of mental clarity that is not forced or artificially created, but naturally emerges when self-monitoring stops dominating cognitive space, and instead of thoughts competing for attention, they begin to organize themselves more smoothly, allowing you to think without being trapped inside the process of thinking itself at every moment. There comes a point where the way you see yourself begins to align more closely with how you actually exist in a moment, and this reduces the internal distortion that once made you feel split between observer and participant, because you are no longer constantly adjusting your identity in real time, and instead you begin to experience a more consistent sense of self that is not built through constant evaluation, but through direct experience, and this creates a quieter form of confidence that does not depend on analyzing yourself continuously, but on simply existing without interruption from constant internal correction. Communication begins to feel less like a performance and more like a natural extension of thought, because you are no longer interrupting yourself mid-expression to evaluate how every word might be perceived, and instead your thoughts and speech begin to connect more directly, allowing ideas to move outward without constant internal editing, and this creates a smoother and more relaxed way of interacting with others, where attention is no longer divided between speaking and monitoring speech, and instead remains present in the conversation itself, which makes even simple exchanges feel more natural and less mentally demanding. In moments of calm presence, you may notice that your mind no longer feels like it is constantly filled with commentary about yourself, and instead there is space where experience can simply unfold without interruption, and this does not mean that thoughts disappear completely, but rather that they no longer dominate your attention in every moment, allowing you to engage with life in a more direct and less fragmented way, where awareness is still active but no longer turned inward as a constant evaluation loop that defines how you experience yourself in each passing situation. As you move forward in experience, the internal structures that once made you constantly reflect on yourself begin to lose their influence, and instead of repeatedly analyzing past moments or predicting how you are being perceived, your attention becomes more grounded in what is actually happening now, and this shift allows you to stop living through fragmented self-images and instead experience life as a continuous flow, where each moment does not need to be broken into layers of self-interpretation, but can simply exist as it is without being constantly filtered through internal judgment systems. You begin to notice that both versions of yourself have always existed, the part that overthinks and the part that simply experiences, but the difference now is that neither one fully controls your entire awareness, and instead you start developing the ability to move between them without getting trapped in constant self-evaluation. And this creates a more flexible internal experience where awareness is no longer fixed in one mode, but can shift naturally depending on the situation, allowing both reflection and presence to coexist without one completely overwhelming the other in every moment of your daily life. When internal evaluation reduces its dominance, the mind begins to settle into a more stable rhythm, similar to how turbulent water eventually becomes still again after constant disturbance, and in this state thoughts still appear, but they no longer create strong internal resistance or fragmentation, and instead they move through awareness without disrupting your sense of presence. And this allows your cognitive system to function without unnecessary emotional tension, making even complex thinking feel lighter and less overwhelming because it is no longer being continuously monitored and corrected by an overactive internal observer system. As internal monitoring fades into the background, your attention naturally begins to expand outward again, and simple details of life become more noticeable without effort, such as small sounds, subtle changes in light, or the feeling of movement in space, and this return of sensory awareness is not something forced, but something that reappears when mental space is no longer occupied by constant self-evaluation. And in this way, presence becomes less about trying to be mindful and more about naturally being available to experience life without internal interruption. At a stable point, attention no longer feels like it is constantly switching back and forth between observation and experience, and instead it settles into a more continuous outward focus where life feels less interrupted by internal commentary, and this does not mean that self-awareness disappears completely, but that it stops dominating every moment of perception, allowing a more balanced state where thinking, acting, and experiencing can occur without constant internal interruption, creating a quieter and more integrated way of being present in daily life without feeling mentally divided at every step of awareness. When presence becomes more natural again, you realize that peace was never about eliminating thoughts or controlling every aspect of your mind, but about no longer turning every thought into a reflection about yourself, and this subtle shift allows experience to feel more direct and less filtered, because you are no longer constantly stepping outside of life to evaluate how you are living it, and instead you begin to simply live it, with awareness still intact but no longer used as a tool for constant self-surveillance in every single passing moment of your daily experience. And in the end, what you begin to understand is that being too self-aware was never the problem by itself, but becoming trapped inside self-awareness without direction was what created distance from peace, and as this realization settles, the mind no longer feels like it is watching itself constantly, but instead feels like it is simply existing, without pressure to analyze every moment of being. And in that quiet simplicity, you discover something subtle but powerful, that peace was never something you had to reach outside yourself. It was always available once attention stopped turning inward all the time.